Chapter 1. Evolution of my research question. Before I delve into all the work I've undergone, I'd like to touch on how my research question has evolved during the process of working on the graduate project. My initial research question is as follows. How do cinematographers utilise conventional camera techniques in practice whilst collaborating with other heads of departments to produce unique visual storytelling within a miniature set? My core focus is still relevant to cinematography and how I developed a unique visual style utilising miniature models. However, during the process of pre-production, I took a more multifaceted approach, pushing myself to not only work with camera, but also take the lead on all creative decisions relevant to the use of these models. This led to the evolution of my question to not specify it specifically to cinematography, but also incorporate the other roles I undertook. My new research question is as follows. How do filmmakers take a multifaceted approach to filmmaking whilst collaborating with other heads of departments to produce unique visual storytelling utilising miniature models? Chapter 2. Introduction to A Fork in the Road. A Fork in the Road is the graduate film which I've been a part of since its conceptualisation back in November. The script itself is a dry comedy based on the misfortunes of a young man's life trying to reclaim control of the chaos which unfolds in front of him. There have been 5 drafts of the script, tailored over 4 months to produce the most refined and creative boundary-pushing material possible. The collaboration between myself, the director, and production designer led to an exciting experimental medium which we wanted to shoot to add an elevated sense of art to the film. This aspect is the void, an insight into the mind of our protagonist going through a self-inflicted hellscape. With this in mind, Aidan Ayul, our production designer and talented miniature model maker, collaborated to utilise his skill set of creation with my ambitious directorial voice. This led perfectly into our pre-production phase, where we got the green light from writer and director Joe Rewbottom to produce these scenes, adding further depth to the protagonist Nick. At this stage, my role had evolved from cinematographer to also the second unit director, allowing me the creative freedom to not be constrained to any boundaries when concerning the visual style being created through the miniature models. Chapter 3. Pre-production. Pre-production for the miniature shoot was collaborative, involving continued communication between myself, the PD, the producer, and the director. This area of work allowed for an aspect of my research question to be answered, through the process of creative minds working alongside each other to achieve an end goal of unique visual style utilising miniature models. The early stages of this process began with research into the most feasible camera for the task. From my first feasibility test during project development, I'd undergone research into the correct technical aspects of camera to shoot these models, which led me to using the Canon 6D. However, this experience was nowhere near perfect, with many flaws specifically related to the camera and lighting. I learnt from that experience by conducting more research into camera and lens choices, ISO and shutter rate settings, and the correct choice of logarithmic footage to help bring to life my aspirations for the graduate shoot. After undergoing this research, I developed a secure understanding of what I would need to achieve as a cinematographer to best represent production designer Aidan's work. This also included the aspect of stop motion, which I will speak in detail about later on. Conceptualizing the void was one of the most engaging, collaborative elements I've had at university, accepting one another's creative output and merging our ideas until it blossomed into something completely new, but still bound to that of the source material. Director Joe Rewbottom engaged with me and Aidan over several meetings, where we'd bring our ideas to him and he'd evaluate their relevance to the story overall. These meetings between heads of departments established a finalised version for how the void would work in line with the rest of the film, leading to Joe rewriting all the void sequences in matrimony with the direction I had envisioned. After these changes were made, I went on various location recce's to determine the most viable options to base our miniature model off, so that Aidan could begin his development of Mac's store. I decided the most feasible shop was Winton Superstores. This was primarily due to the accessibility the owner offered us, not only giving us permission to develop a miniature model of his shop, but also allowing us to film 2 live-action scenes for the other elements of the film, which were essential for continuity. I knew that I needed to take a multifaceted approach to the work I wanted to achieve, so began creating a schedule closely with Aidan, taking into account budget restrictions, equipment availability, and a feasible workload for production. The first project listed was for a camera test involving the new Canon C300 Mark III. I wanted to better my understanding of its capability for all live-action aspects of the void, so that I would feel confident using it for our shoot. The following 2 projects all involved miniature models. These shoots were initially scheduled as feasibility tests, but due to production restrictions, they had to be made production dates. The final shoot was in the soundstage, to film our protagonist Nick, utilising this controlled environment so that we could implement his performance into the void seamlessly. I'd like to note that this document was tailored and supervised by producer Lily Brewster, as she was responsible for signing off on any officially conducted shooting days. Chapter 4: C300 Mark III Feasibility Test. As I previously mentioned, the C300 Mark III is a new camera to students this year. It was a drastic learning curve to adapt to a cinema camera from my prior experience using DSLRs. This camera offers superior capability to film cinematic creations due to its 4K Super 35mm dual gain output sensor, paired with slow motion capture of up to 120 frames per second without downscaling the resolution. The camera also includes 8 prime lenses to choose from, increasing my options of how to film certain aspects of the project. The feasibility test, which we'll play in a moment, was an intimate time I got to understand the camera's ergonomics and utilise its inbuilt slow motion capture feature to develop my visual style for the project. However, the visual style I wanted to achieve couldn't exclusively be based on the cinematography, so this test I also graded using DaVinci Resolve as preparation for the final product.
Why this ever had to be? So many losing hope in those dreams that they.
Walking past a homeless in a Rolex. Just got off the stage on the Today Show and I basically felt soulless. Years go by and I keep saying I'm gonna use my phone less, but I should just be phoneless. Ignorance is bliss and so is being underground, cause it was fun when we were known less. Sorry, that's cliche, I know I'm so blessed, but Jason keeps on telling me say yes, and truth be told I know he knows best, but I don't wanna do no press. I've seen enough of me on this little screen. I've become so vain and insecure about everything. I feel all this pressure to live up to what they tell me I'm gonna be, so I isolate myself. You can't help me, it's on me. I'm hiding any sign of weakness from my guys. I don't want them second guessing with me. Nemo said to keep my foot on next, cause I can't let them just forget me. But the brags in my raps are getting less and less convincing, so I'd rather just
Why this ever had to be? So many losing hope in those dreams that they.
I wrote that first verse in Denver back in September. It's January now and I'm feeling like myself again. I got Angel back in here, I need his help again. I'm taking time away but wondering what a healthy helping is. Fuck it, they gon' check for me, I tell myself and tell my friends. Avoiding any talks about the elephant, chalking up the hate, the jealousy and just embellishments. But deep down I find myself wondering if the people that write about me are right about me. And I wonder if my exes are oversharing, cause they know a lot about me. I'm a long way from Shelby County, I've been through some local tension. Heard talks of a healthy bounty, sober and focused.
As seen in this test, I was keen to showcase a variety of locations and subjects, to touch base on different elements of cinematography and how that impacts the colouring process. The oversaturated nature of this scene was purely to experiment with how far I could push the scale with colour before it's deemed too far. In contrast, I took my time to colour these scenes to add a deep warmth due to the theme of homeliness and connection present in the content I filmed. This scene also featured my most successful shot, utilising the slow motion feature. This inspired me to think of creative ways I could utilise it within the void to add extra depth to the narrative. More on this later. Chapter 5: Title Card Shoot. Steering away from live action to the first miniature shoot was daunting, as so much was reliant on its success for the rest of the project to succeed. It was also the first time that I had used a Canon R8. The choice of camera decided would best suit this production when concerning miniature models. This was due to its small, agile nature, continuous charging feature, full-frame RAW photography, and capability to be attached to a slider. It perfectly matched the use of the C300 for the live-action elements, which was the most important factor, as both cameras can utilise C-Log3, so grading between them is effortless. The title card sequence was the only miniature model that I exclusively designed. The rest of the models were all directed in line with my vision, but brought to life by Aiden Ayul. I sat with Aiden for many hours, sketching design I had in mind, taking into consideration I wanted it to form on screen via stop motion. After completing the design on paper, Aiden digitalised it so that he could add scale and dimensions to the lettering, enabling us to gauge the physical scale of what we were shooting. Shoot day arrived. I built the set in room P225 on campus, a room with no windows so that lighting could be controlled, something integral to shooting stop motion. From that point, with the assistance of the crew, we set up a black backdrop behind the miniature stage, positioning 3-point lighting so that it was evenly lit. My camera was set up in RAW, with shutter speed of 1 to 2000 and an f-stop of 2.8. We began shooting, systematically placing each piece by piece until our title was formed, a total of 102 shots compiled together to form the animation. Chapter 6. The Degrading Door. The iconography and connotations of doors displays new beginnings, opportunity, and choice of passage. This was integral to the main themes of the script, so executing these scenes correctly was essential to allow the audience to resonate with the story we were trying to tell within the void and the wider screenplay. Before the doors could be created in line with the vision I had, a scale for all the models had to be decided. I then suggested that the scale for the door could only be viable in a few options, as budget restrictions and technical capability to shoot them would vary, the smaller or larger they were. This led to the scale being set to 1 to 18, as it balanced out the pros and cons of each scale on either side of it. The stop motion elements were essential to bring the door to life. I pushed the direction of how the door degrades, wears, and grows ivy during the beginning of the film, to set the standing that this door was actively living inside our protagonist's mind, infecting him with these nightmares. When shooting this scene, I created a frame list, detailing every part of degrading as a process, so that myself and Aiden had a thought out plan for what we wanted to shoot. In the first stages of degrading, we followed the sheet well, but as it became more complex, Aiden was forced to freestyle the application of moss and lichen. After our editor, Ashley Savager, compiled the images together, we were left with a very short final product, not executed to a level I was happy with. This process of degrading took 4 hours and resulted in 142 shots, under half of the planned shots we wanted to achieve. Furthermore, the camera settings I mentioned earlier were incorrect, as my shutter speed was too high and the anti-flicker setting was switched off, leading to unusual lighting changes. Chapter 7. Mac Superstore and Model. After being unsatisfied with the result from the last miniature shoot, I realised that if I was to successfully develop a unique visual style within these scenes, I had to conduct more research and critically analyse my prior shoots. I did this by watching more in-depth tutorials on YouTube, alongside reading chapters 1, 3, 4, 10 and 11 of Animating with Stop Motion Pro written by Mark Sawicki. A further review of the degrading door footage highlighted more issues revolving around the stop motion. This was due to our lighting setup. The use of dido lights was great as they were small, easily adjustable, and created the desired spotlight effect. However, they have tungsten bulbs, meaning over time they generate an increased amount of heat. When left on for an hour, they were untouchable without safety gloves. This led to us being forced to take breaks every hour, leaving the bulbs to cool for 15 minutes. This was an unforeseen circumstance which affected the workflow and lighting continuity for our degrading door shoot. So that these issues wouldn't occur when shooting this scene, I set out a production operation plan, so that things remained professional and orderly while staying in line with safety protocol for production. Every 45 minutes, the lights would be off for 15 minutes. Before the lights are switched off, we make sure the stage of animation is complete so that we are able to start on the next scene, meaning continuity isn't an issue when turned back on. This meant that for the animation blocks, we had to operate more concisely and efficiently to stay within those timed parameters. Max Superstore was the most ambitious model our production design team produced. Each decision I supervised and directed so that it was aligned with the rest of the void scenes. Its creation was made to the same scale as the door, at 1 to an 18th. This meant the shooting conditions were identical to the rest of shoot, and the stage we developed for the door scenes transferred perfectly to this. It features a battery-powered lighting system in the shop front and flat above, with digital prints of the exact imagery that the real shop front included. Furthermore, the inside of the shop was accessible via a side panel, so the Mac model could be seen inside the shop, paired with working door hinges so that the stop animation of the door opening was viable. I wanted the corner shop to parallel the degrading nature that was provided to the door so that the aesthetic within the void was consistent. Our production design team applied the same moss paste and lichen to the building, as well as purposely weathering the brickwork so that the model wasn't pristine. Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas and Henry Selick's Coraline were largely influential in the creation of the Mac model, as I wanted this scene to have aspects of horror to develop our protagonist's nightmares to be terrifying. That's why the decision was made to remove noticeable facial features, replacing them with blacked out eyes and a sinister grin. The look of this model paired with the stop motion elevated the disjointed, dystopian effect of the film, creating a horrifying outcome. After these scenes were complete, all stop motion was wrapped on the film, leaving the final insert shots to be added. The 4 models left the film with the washing machine, the bin bags, the bad door, and the good door. Their inclusion into the void was to reinforce the issues our protagonist has with looking after himself. The lack of self-discipline and respect are ultimately the reasons why these nightmares are infecting his day-to-day life. Our protagonist is the fork in the road. His choices impact his life. The world isn't against him like he believes. When shooting these brief scenes, I made sure the camera shot in 4K 25 frames per second in C-Log 3 to match that of our live action sequences, so that post-production was smoother. The inserts were simple, shooting them all in a fixed position at different distances and focal lengths, ranging from 35mm to 55, so there were options for what best suited the scenes. The bad door and good door were positioned on our stage at slight angles, so that in post we could superimpose the protagonist in between them, creating the illusion he is moving towards the door, making his choice. Chapter 8. Soundstage Void Shoot. With all the miniature shoots wrapped, it led to the first live action stage of our production. Our producer had booked the stage for a whole day, collaborating with myself and the production designer to have the correct lighting setup and floor plan. With no time before this for rehearsals, I made rough cuts of all the void sequences in line with the shot list I developed, allowing me to have a secure understanding of what I needed to shoot. On arrival at the soundstage, I determined the best 3-point lighting setup with my AC. I used a crew member as a placeholder for where Nick would stand to establish the correct conditions. As mentioned earlier on, my C300 feasibility test allowed me to practice with slow motion capture feature. This led to me deciding to use it for all the live action scenes in the void, an artistic choice made to emphasise the stuck, slow, forced perspective that our protagonist is in, further adding to the narrative visual style I wanted to establish. After hours of setting up and making sure all technical aspects for the shoot were ready to go, Callum Diaz starring as Nick arrived on set. I sat with him for 30 minutes, breaking down the current mindscape Nick was in during these void sequences. I presented all the void scenes as they stood, so he could take in the horror of the Max Superstore scene and the redemption arc presented in the final void scene. We rehearsed together for an hour, scene by scene, shot by shot, until I felt comfortable with his performance. I cleared the soundstage, so only a limited amount of crew were in the space, freeing him of any distractions. This led to a performance displaying a multitude of emotions, perfectly situating himself as Nick at each stage of the film. Chapter 9. Editing. The final stage of bringing all of this to life was in the post-production process. As I best knew the content and story I was trying to develop through the void scenes, I took on the role of editing, colour grading, and sound design. Firstly, I organised my workspace within DaVinci Resolve Studio, making an ergonomic work environment. I created a bin for all scenes, transferring all the correct footage into each relevant file, as well as creating a separate one for sound design. Within each of these bins, I added a timeline, meaning all of the void content was under one roof, again increasing my efficiency while editing. The first stage was cutting the clips together. I used my shot list which I developed in pre-production as a reference point for what I was aiming to achieve. In each timeline, I made rough cuts for the scenes, gauging the pacing and continuity. From there, I had a peer review session with Joe, clarifying my vision with him and also receiving feedback on the successes and flaws so far. Once I felt comfortable with how the scenes flowed, I began colouring. Generally speaking, colour grading is the last aspect of post-production. However, I needed to grade all of the footage first so that I could implement special effects at the end without disrupting the project. The first stage of colouring was implementing a node tree to the colour page of my project. This allows me to adjust a range of settings in a particular order to achieve the best quality. This node is where I implemented my colour space transform. Here I input what logarithmic footage the camera was recording in line with my project settings so that all the image data was available to me. From there, each node after that is self-explanatory. This affects balancing exposure, contrast, saturation, temperature, etc. When adjustments have been made in all the relevant nodes to a place I'm happy with, I then use the power window nodes to experiment with colour and effects I wanted to add. This window I specifically made to tailor the overall colour of the image. This one was used to add a radial blur effect, softening focus around Nick. When making final refinements to my grade, I sought advice from professional colourist John Bruce, who has worked recently on projects like The Tattooists of Auschwitz and Shetland. He said I had achieved a good initial grade, not crushing the image and keeping the blacks in Nick's eyes, which is always important. He mentioned that I could possibly be more experimental with the grade, as generally, short films are a safe space to push the boundaries with colour. His advice gave me the confidence to use a more obvious green tone. This decision led to the void scene having a sickly, sci-fi, horror-esque aesthetic, perfectly adding to the visual storytelling elements of the void. This also created a more impactful final void scene, as the reveal of the good door is in stark contrast colour-wise to the rest of the space, presenting a bright, hopeful nature to the decision Nick makes. With the pacing and colouring in a comfortable place, I began toying with different effects to emphasise the mind space of Nick. Firstly, I needed to establish the pitch black void effect. I did this by utilising the magic mask tool. Here, I would key the subject I want. This tool then tracks a mask on the subject throughout the clip. I then needed to add an alpha output, attaching the nose I did the mask on to it. This then removes any image data other than that of what I have masked, creating a black space around the subject. I repeated this process for each individual clip so that the void effect was present throughout all scenes. Within the Mac Superstore scene, I created a rolling video of all miniature models passing from one side of the frame to the next. I placed this at the bottom layer of my timeline, adding Nick above it, so that it creates the effect that these elements are coming from his mind. To increase the intensity of this scene, I then added the radial blur effect to the clip, keying it in at a slow rate, increasing it drastically as the clip progressed, until his thoughts were spinning out of control. As a last addition to the special effects, I wanted the transitions into the void to be seamless with the live action elements of the film. Again, utilising the radial blur tool, keying it in at a high intensity, then slowly lowering it as the clip progresses. This effect added to the sleep paralysis nightmare I was trying to achieve, by having his body bound and constricted to a space, while Nick is forced to watch the horrors unfold in front of him. The final stage of post-production was sound design. As I'd achieved the visual style I was aiming for, the sound was incremental to emphasising the performance and story being told. All sound effects I used from a subscription-based sound library called Epidemic. I sourced a range of sound effects, all typical of horror and sci-fi genres, with other sound effects to be paired with the movements of stop motion. The beginning of the film features the first void sequence. The sound design for this scene was fairly simple, as I didn't want to overwhelm the audience in the first moments of viewing. The sound we initially hear is a reverse glass breaking sound. This sound I purposely placed at the start, as featured in the last void scene the normal version of the effect plays, detailing Nick breaking free from the evil door. This scene also introduces the audience to the monotonous hum, which plays as a consistent role within the void. The Mac Superstore Nightmare sequence is the most complex sound design out of all the scenes, due to the dramatic, fearful tone I wanted the audience to experience with Nick. I used rises and crescendos to add elevated tension, in time with the cuts and visuals we see on screen. Interweave throughout are specific sound effects for the movements of each element shown on screen, be that the door opening, Mac's joints creaking, or the miniatures swirling around Nick's mind. All sound effects work in matrimony with the visuals displayed on screen, which is my core objective when considering the design. The final void scene details a change in tone. The same hum effect is present throughout, until it fades into the abyss when Nick makes the choice to make a change in his life. This change was introduced by a wind chime effect, cued in to play when the good door appears, overwhelming that of the hum void effect. Chapter 10. Reasoning for submitting a whole film as graduate project. As detailed throughout this video essay, my goal has been to develop unique visual storytelling utilising these miniature models, whilst collaborating with each head of department. I believe my research question can only successfully be answered when all of these scenes are viewed within the wider context of the film, embedding them within the narrative. My graduate submission is the third draft of the film, in a nearly complete but still unrefined state. However, all void sequences I developed which are shown are fully fleshed out. I will also attach all the void sequences in a separate folder, so a further review of them can be easily accessed. This project has taken an estimated total of 430 hours over 7 months. With the multifaceted approach I took, these hours have been compiled from different roles at each production phase of the film. This was by far the most intense but amazing experience I've had at university, something I won't forget.